Welcome to the 1% Oregon Extended Assessment Participation Reporting webinar. Please note that all information reviewed in this webinar is also available in the 1% Oregon Extended Participation Reporting Requirements for Oregon Districts document. This document, along with all other resources related to this webinar and extended assessment reporting, are available on ODE's Extended Assessment webpage under the Policies section. We're going to start off today's webinar with a little background information related to extended assessment participation requirements. The participation reporting requirements we will be discussing today are part of federal law, included in the most recent reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, known as the Every Student Succeeds Act. The first requirement is that for each subject, English Language Arts, Math, and Science, the total number of students assessed using an alternate assessment based on alternate academic achievement standards may not exceed 1% of the total number of students in the state assessed in that subject. The second requirement indicates that the state cannot prohibit an LEA from assessing more than 1% of its assessed students in any subject with an alternate assessment based on alternate academic achievement standards. So what this means is that school districts may assess more than 1% of their students with an alternate assessment, but the state as a whole may not exceed 1%. Remember, the goal of this participation monitoring is to ensure accurate identification, regardless of the percent. The next requirements are for those districts who need to assess more than 1% of their students with an alternate assessment based on accurate identification practices. The first requirement states that these districts are required to submit information justifying the need to assess more than 1% of its assessed students in any subject on an alternate assessment. The second requirement is that the state must provide appropriate oversight as determined by the state of a district who submits information to the state. In short, all districts who need to exceed 1% participation in alternate assessment must submit their justification for doing so, and the state must provide oversight to those districts. Our last slide of requirements are relevant for states with participation that exceeds 1%. Firstly, the state must provide to the U.S. Department of Education assurance that each district that exceeds 1% participation will address any disproportionality in the percentage of students in any focal group taking an alternate assessment. The student focal groups include 7 racial ethnic categories: American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Black, African American, Hispanic, multiracial, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and white. Also included is multilingual students with English learner status. The second requirement on this slide says the state must provide assurance that for each district that exceeds 1% participation, only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities take an alternate assessment. We wanted to briefly review these requirements because each of the reporting and monitoring activities covered in the remainder of this webinar are directly related to at least one of these 6 requirements. So far in this webinar, we have been referring to alternate assessments based on alternate academic achievement standards. Oregon's alternate assessment based on alternate academic achievement standards is known as the Oregon Extended Assessment. You will see this abbreviated as OREXT, which is short for Oregon Extended. The Oregon Extended Assessments are based on Oregon academic standards that have been reduced in depth, breadth, and complexity. In order for districts to ensure that only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities participate in the Oregon Extended Assessments, ODE has developed the Alternate Assessment Decision-Making Guidance, which is a required guidance document that IEP teams must use when determining which students should take the Oregon Extended Assessments. Please note that this guidance includes criteria applicable to decision-making for both the Oregon Extended Assessments, which are academic, and the ALT-ELPA, which is Oregon's Alternate English Language Proficiency Assessment. This document includes checklists and flowcharts to support teams with decision-making, and these checklists and flowcharts are available in both English and Spanish. Before we get into reporting requirements, I'd like to take just a moment to discuss why this reporting and monitoring is so important. First and foremost, we need to consider the purpose of statewide assessment. Statewide assessment is intended to look at how our system is doing, helping students achieve towards a particular set of standards. So we really want to make sure that there is a match between the instruction our students are receiving and the assessments in which they are participating. Misalignment between instruction and assessment will provide unhelpful and inaccurate information related to measuring your instructional system's effectiveness. For instance, if a student is receiving instruction based on general academic standards, even if that instruction is somewhat modified, assessing that student using the Oregon Extended would measure their progress towards alternate achievement standards, which are significantly modified in depth, breadth, and complexity. Therefore, you would be measuring progress towards different standards than what the student is being instructed on. To support this alignment, ODE has published alternate achievement standards in English language arts, mathematics, and science. These documents are available on ODE's Extended Assessment webpage under the Alternate Academic Achievement Standards section. Continuing with considerations of instructional alignment is another important consideration of access to rigorous instruction. When a student is identified to take the Oregon Extended, it is indicative of a significant shift in the instructional expectations for that student, indicating that this student requires significant modified instruction across all subject areas. So we want to ensure that only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are having their instruction based on alternate academic achievement standards, because we want to ensure that all students have access to appropriate, rigorous instruction. Additionally, we know that the instruction students have access to has a significant impact on their outcomes. In the short term, we're talking about potentially increasing opportunity gaps for student achievement. And in the long term, we're considering things like diploma type and post-high school options. Again, what's important is to understand the impact of both over or under identification and work to ensure accurate identification to the greatest extent possible. Now we're going to transition into the part of the webinar where we discuss Oregon's plan to meet those requirements we reviewed at the beginning of the webinar. We have a 5-step process for meeting those requirements. We are going to review each of these steps in more detail on the slides to come. The process starts with a review of data. Districts review their data, and ODE reviews our data. Next, there is an initial submission by all school districts. So all school districts in Oregon are required to submit their projected participation numbers and rates by October 1st. Then, those districts who projected to exceed 1% participation will submit additional information by November 15th. ODE will review district submissions and accept or request revisions if necessary. We try to have that completed around December 15th. Finally, ODE will post a report of the information collected sometime in the spring, typically. Let's start by looking at the first step, review data. The Oregon Department of Education reviews data from the previous 3 years of test administration. So we're looking at students who actually took the assessment. We know that for a variety of reasons, the differences between the students who are found eligible to take the assessment and students who actually end up taking the assessment can be quite large for some districts. So ODE is looking at who actually took the test. For participation rates, we're just looking at the previous year. We look at all grades combined by content area. This includes 3 through 8 and 11 for ELA and math, and 5, 8, and 11 for science. For disproportionality data, we look at all grades combined by content area and by the focal groups that I mentioned earlier. For disproportionality, we look at the previous 3 years of participation data combined. This is because extended assessment participation is such a small number of students that if we calculate disproportionality data on a single year of participation, the data will be very reactive to small changes. So we want to use multiple years to create more consistency and stabilization in the data we're looking at. While ODE is looking at historical data, districts should be looking forward. Districts will be looking at your projected data. So what are you expecting to happen this year? First, you'll need to determine the projected number of identified students to participate in the Oregon Extended. Remember, this decision is made by a student's IEP team and should be indicated on their IEP document. Most likely, whatever special education database your district uses should be able to provide a report of who these students are. Additionally, you will need to figure out the total number of eligible students to be assessed. This number includes both students eligible to take the extended assessment as well as the general assessment. You'll need this data as all tested grades combined, differentiated by content area. One quick note on projected participation numbers, please make sure to include all students who are eligible to participate in statewide assessment. This means that even if you know the student will be opted out or exempted from statewide testing, you still count them in your projected numbers. Here's an example of the data that districts are going to be asked to submit. For example, a district projects that 5 students combining grades 5, 8, and 11 are eligible to participate in the Oregon Extended Assessments for Science. Their total number of students in grades 5, 8, and 11 eligible to participate in statewide assessment is 340. This includes both general and extended participation. Using the formula at the bottom of the slide, the projected number of resident students identified for Oregon Extended divided by the total number of resident students eligible to be assessed multiplied by 100 will equal the district's projected participation rate. For this example, 5 divided by 340 multiplied by 100 rounded to 1 decimal point equals a participation rate of 1.5. You will then be asked the question, does the district project to exceed 1% participation in science on the Oregon Extended? In this case, the district would respond yes, because 1.5 is greater than 1. If the rate is 1.0 or less, they would reply no. All districts will submit the data points we just reviewed for English Language Arts, mathematics, and science. Additionally, you'll be asked to submit a district assurance to ODE. This assurance reads, the district assures the Oregon Department of Education that applicable administration, staff, and parents have been informed of and are adhering to the criteria outlined in the alternate assessment decision-making guidance in determining student eligibility for participation in the Oregon Extended Assessments. Again, all districts will submit this information by October 1st. Next, we're going to take a look at the Smartsheet where districts will report this information. This Smartsheet submission form is available on ODE's Extended Assessment webpage under the Policies section. You'll start off by selecting your district and filling out a little contact information about yourself. Here is what the English Language Arts participation submission session looks like. In the first box, you'll input the district's projected number of ELA Oregon Extended participants. We've also included a description reminder. The next box, you'll input the district's projected number of total ELA participants. Then you'll do your rate calculation and insert your projected Oregon Extended participation rate in the third box. Lastly, you'll be asked to indicate whether or not your district projects to exceed 1% participation in ELA on the Oregon Extended. You will then complete these submissions for mathematics and science. Finally, at the bottom of the form, you will provide district assurance to ODE by checking the box under the assurance statement. The next part of the process is an additional submission due by November 15th and is only required for identified districts. There are two ways that you can be identified to complete the second submission. The first way is that the data you submitted by October 1st indicates that your district expects to exceed 1% participation in at least one content area. The second way you can be identified is if last year your district did not project to exceed 1% participation, but then ended up doing so. That means that you did not submit justification information or a participation plan last year. Because you ended up going over 1% last year, you will be required to submit this year. For the second submission, each identified district will be required to complete the 1% Oregon Extended Participation Reporting District Justification and Plan Submission form. This fillable Word document that can be found on ODE's Extended Assessment webpage. Once you have completed this form, you will upload it into a Smartsheet submission form. Sometime shortly after you complete your initial October 1st submission, ODE will review your data and determine whether you are required to complete the second submission. You'll receive an email from your regional ESD assessment partner indicating the outcome of that review with specific instructions for next steps. Along with this email, you'll also receive a data profile that includes the previous 3 years of extended assessment participation testing data for your district. Additionally, if you submitted a district justification and plan submission form last year, we will send you a copy of that previous submission back to you for reference as you complete this year's form. Let's go ahead and take a look at this form. You'll start off by indicating which district this form is for. There are also additional instructions and context included throughout this form, as you can see here on the first page. Section 1 of this form is simply a recommendation that districts complete a data analysis prior to completing the rest of the form. Included is a guidance document from the National Center on Educational Outcomes that provides a variety of ways to look at your data. Section 2 of this form is where you'll submit your justification information for why you need to assess more than 1% of your students with the Oregon Extended Assessment. Please remember that the purpose of this reporting is to ensure accurate identification of extended assessment participation. There is no 1% cap placed on districts, only the state as a whole. If districts need to test more than 1% of their students with the Oregon Extended, that is allowable, and those districts need to submit information to justify this need. This is Oregon's process for providing that information to ODE. So this section of the document includes 7 factors that are common for why districts need to assess more than 1% of their students with an alternate assessment. You'll go through each factor on the form and report which factors are applicable for your district. Here's factor 1, size of student population. And there is only one reflection question for this factor. Does your district have a small overall student population that increases the likelihood of exceeding 1% participation in the Oregon Extended? If this factor is applicable to your district, you'll check the applicable box and input your district evidence and reflection in the box below. If this factor is not applicable to your district, you'll check the not applicable box and skip to factor 2, leaving the box below blank. Some factors have more than one reflection question. For instance, factor 3, participation rates based on assessment content, type of school, or program. If this factor is applicable to your district, you will check the applicable box and respond to relevant questions below. You only need to respond to the reflection questions that are relevant to your district. Questions that are not relevant may be left blank. Make sure that if you check applicable, you respond to at least one of the questions related to that factor. Otherwise, your submission may be returned for correction. Again, if this factor is not applicable to your district, simply check the not applicable box and skip to the next factor, leaving all those questions blank. You'll review 6 factors, and then the 7th factor is a place for you to indicate any other contributing factors your district may be experiencing that were not included as one of the previous 6 factors. The end of this section includes some additional resources that your district may find helpful in completing this analysis and developing your participation plan. Section 3 of this form is about your extended assessment participation plan. So please remember that the plan is to ensure that only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are found eligible for and participate in the Oregon Extended. The purpose of the plan is not to get your participation rate under 1%. So this section starts off with an opportunity to reflect on your previous year's plan. You'll see under section 3A, 3 reflection questions. What specific measurable outcomes did we achieve and which ones did we miss? What challenges or obstacles did we encounter and how did we address them? And finally, what feedback did we receive during implementation and how can we use it to improve our approach? If you have not submitted a plan previously, you can simply leave this section blank. Section 3B is where you will report your plan to ensure that only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are found eligible for and participate in the Oregon Extended. There are some criteria listed here on what we recommend to include in a successful plan. And I want to draw your attention to the sentence after the list that states, regardless of the applicable factors identified in section 2, districts must include staff training on the alternate assessment decision-making guidance as part of this plan. So it's really important that you reflect on and include this information in your plan submission. Section 4 is about disproportionality. Remember the requirement at the beginning of the webinar that all districts expecting to exceed 1% participation must address any disproportionality in their participation data. Therefore, all identified districts will be required to provide assurance via selecting a checkbox when they upload this form. However, some districts have disproportionality flagged by ODE in their participation data. These districts will additionally be required to provide a description of how they plan to address any disproportionality in their participation data. These districts will provide that information here where it says district plan to address disproportionality. Please remember that you will receive an email from your regional ESD assessment partner stating whether or not you need to complete this section of the form. Once this form is completed, you will submit it to ODE via a Smartsheet submission called District Justification and Plan Submission Upload. You can find this Smartsheet on ODE's Extended Assessment webpage. You'll start completing this form by selecting your district and inputting some contact information for the person completing the form. Next, you'll select those same justification factors that you selected on the form we just reviewed. Please make sure that the factors selected in each place match each other. Then you'll provide assurance to ODE that the district has a participation plan by selecting the checkbox. Next, you'll provide your disproportionality assurance to ODE by selecting another checkbox. And finally, you'll upload your district justification and plan submission form using the upload feature in Smartsheets. ODE would prefer you upload the form as a Word document, but you can also upload it as a PDF. The next step in our 5-step process is for ODE to review district submissions. Upon review, you will be notified if your submission was accepted or if it requires revision. If your submission requires revision, you'll work with ODE to collaboratively set a new due date for revisions. A quick note on revisions: the most common need for revision is that a district has left a required box blank. For instance, your district was identified with disproportionality in your participation data, but you did not complete section 4 of the form. This will require a revision. The other less common need for revision is if your plan includes an action that doesn't follow Oregon Administrative Rule or the alternate assessment decision-making guidance. In that case, you'll work with ODE to make appropriate revisions to come into alignment with related requirements. And lastly, I'd like to note that it is best practice to try and avoid including any student identifiable information in your submissions. The final step is for ODE to publish an analysis report of submitted information. This report will include assurance and justification factors reported by district as required by the Every Student Succeeds Act. Beyond that, this report includes an analysis of data submitted by districts in an effort to provide really an overview of district practices, challenges, and commitments related to Oregon Extended Assessment participation. This report, it's intended to serve both as a transparency tool for public accountability, but also as a resource guide for districts in your process of refining your assessment practices to ensure appropriate participation in the Oregon Extended Assessments. So we've reached the end of the webinar and we've reviewed our 5-step process to complete the Oregon Extended Assessment participation reporting requirements. Please remember that we're here to help. If you require technical assistance related to submissions, please reach out to our wonderful regional ESD assessment partner, Amy Rockwell, via the contact information included on this slide. If you have policy questions related to this reporting, please feel free to reach out to me, Mason Rivers, at ODE via the contact information included here on this slide. Thank you so much for your attention throughout this webinar and for your dedication to this very important work on behalf of our students here in Oregon. Take care.